Over the past 100 years, no other natural disaster has caused more death and destruction than floods. They can happen any place, any day, any time. And they will likely only get worse. As people cluster around coastal regions and floodplains, our growing population will confront the awesome power of water.
Flood. Flood is the most common environmental hazard worldwide. This is due to the vast geographical distribution of river floodplains and low-lying coastal areas. It is largely classified as an overflow of water onto normally dry lands.
Floods can form after heavy rain over a long period or when a large snowfall melts. There are many different types of flooding which fall under three main categories. The first results from overflow. After heavy rain, a river can burst its banks. The water can engulf entire valleys far from the precipitation zone. Other tributaries add to the flow of water, worsening the deluge further downstream. The second type of flooding involves the accumulation of water in lowlands or basins. In normal weather conditions, water is absorbed into the ground and merges with the water table. When the ground is saturated, water builds up in low-lying areas. Runoff then quickly fills the valley and its waterways. The third type is caused by urbanization in flood-prone areas. Excess water passing through drainage systems can accumulate in low-lying zones. This effect is worsened by the coverage of land with buildings and impermeable surfaces such as concrete. Less water can be absorbed into the ground, overloading sewers.
Floods mostly occur in low-lying areas all over the world. In Canada, interior plains and St. Lawrence lowlands are places where floods can mostly occur. River floodplains and coastal areas are the most susceptible places or regions to flooding. However, it is possible for flooding to occur in areas with unusual long periods of heavy rainfall. Floods are the most expensive natural hazard in terms of property damage. They destroy massive businesses, buildings, and other properties. Additionally, it can affect human life, damage to property, destruction of crops, and loss of livestock. It has a negative effect on the Canadian economy as it destroys the transportational regions and a lot of manufacturing companies.
Moving on to managing the flood. The government has a number of responsibilities before, during, and after the flood.
Preparing for floods is a shared responsibility. Local governments, provincial emergency measure organizations, and provincial water resource organizations bear most of the responsibility for planning and relief operations. The federal government, through Public Safety Canada, encourages provincial and local governments to set up emergency plans. And under the National Flood Damage Reduction Program, the federal, provincial, and territorial governments cooperate to map and designate flood risk areas across Canada.
These flood risk maps are very important as they help identify essential infrastructure and what areas are at the most risk of being flooded.
There are a number of measures taken by the government to mitigate floods using structural and non-structural mitigation techniques. Non-structural measures include regulating land use in the floodplain, floodproofing measures, acquiring property in the floodplain or relocating structures, altering upstream land management practices, and establishing and maintaining flood forecasting and warning systems. The purpose of flood forecasting is to provide as much advance warning as possible of an impending flood. Flood forecasting systems generally have a similar operational setup to carry out the following activities: collecting and managing pertinent data, developing river forecasting procedures, providing advice for flood control, and also for floodway operations, emergency diking, etc., and communicating flood warnings. Also, a number of flood control operations are carried out to proactively minimize the effects of floods. There are also a number of structural measures that are taken, which include building dams and dikes, for example, the Brewer Park Dike in Ottawa. Also, floodproofing is a very popular structural measure. Well, what is floodproofing, you may ask? Floodproofing is a means of protecting individual structures in the flood fringe from damage. To learn more about floodproofing, please visit the link below.
Now let's examine the 2013 Calgary and Southern Alberta flood. 4 years ago, Calgary and surrounding areas were devastated by the flood. The water spilled over the banks of the city's two major rivers in June 2013, causing millions in damage and the death of a Calgary woman. It was a dark day for the city. But the city got to work, and with the help of both federal and provincial governments, they set about to making a flood-resilient city. After the flood, an expert panel came up with 27 recommendations for Calgary. The city says half were complete, and they are all underway, even the more difficult ones like addressing the changing climate and adopting new design standards. High River, just south of Calgary, has spent $400 million since the 2013 flood to upgrade sewer lines and build barriers between the river and the town. In addition, Calgary has invested $150 million in flood mitigation measures, with another $92 million from the province. Also, in the 2017 federal budget, the government allocated $2 billion for a disaster mitigation and adaptation fund. Therefore, we know that the government is learning from its mistakes and is now taking measures to effectively manage floods. Now, insurance companies weren't going to be the ones that are picking the tab, since overland flooding, aka the water that comes through doors and windows, is not covered by most policy. Now moving on to paying for the natural hazard.
Throughout the years, floods have been recurring disasters within our community, not only damaging our infrastructure and houses, but our life as well. Before a flood hits, the government takes procedures, such as spreading awareness through conservation programs, safety drills for the flood, and training to assist when the flood hits to mitigate the impact of the flood. The question that usually follows after the occurrence of floods is who will pay for it. But while the provincial government usually deals with that issue at hand, the federal financial disaster assistance arrangement gives a donation based off of a formula after an appeal from the provincial government should the cost of the flood exceed the budget used to combat floods and other disasters. Also, non-profit organizations such as the Red Cross collect donations to assist in rebuilding and combating these floods. Aside from the damage to infrastructure, we often ask ourselves, are we insured? Well, what is flood insurance? Flood insurance is coverage for damage to property caused by a flood. Although floods have occurred in the past, historically, insurance policies have not covered damage by overland flooding. Depending on your insurance policy, you may or may not be covered and could have to spend up to $1,000 annually for flood insurance.
Keep your eye on the weather and sign up for flood alerts. Buying sandbags might help, but check government advice about how best to protect your home. Get an emergency flood kit ready and prepare important documents in case you have to leave in a rush. Make sure you know how to quickly turn off your water, gas and electricity mains. Clear leaves from your drains and, if it's safe, during a flood, act quickly. Flood water can rise fast. So, if there's an emergency and you're in danger, call 999 and follow the advice. Move family, pets and important stuff upstairs. Put people before property and check on neighbours. Stay safe and don't walk or drive through fast-flowing water. If you have been flooded, be careful. Don't turn on the electricity before getting it checked by an electrician. Call your insurance company and register your claim. Be contaminated, so wear protective gear when cleaning up and get advice about recycling any waste.
Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something about floods today.